Hey everyone, I'm Stephanie.
And I'm Sandy.
And this is the Italian American Stories podcast. All right, well, how's it going, Mom?
Good. It's good to be back doing a podcast.
Doing another episode, knocking them out.
This will be an exciting one.
Yeah, I'm really excited to tell today's story. It comes to us from Regina, and she lives in Arvada, which is a suburb of Denver. But she's an Italian, born and raised in the North Denver area. Just
like me,
just like you. Yep, exactly. And it's really cool because she contacted me on Instagram, and when we were finally able to touch base and talk, we kind of just started our conversation off reminiscing about North Denver and all of the memories that we have. And it was really cool because you and Regina are around the same age.
Yeah, very close.
Very close.
3 or 4 years.
3 or 4 years, yep. She was telling me stories. I was like, wow, that's so similar to the stories that Mom has told me.
Yeah, that's fun.
It is, yeah. Just, those North Denver stories, just the places there, Carboni's.
Old stomping grounds.
Old stomping ground, exactly. Yeah, Gaetano's. And it was really kind of funny because her Italian name is Capra, and then we're Smaldones. And so we were talking, and she was like, yeah, my sister used to date a John Smaldone. And that was her older sister. So kind of putting the dates together, I was like, well, my uncle was John Smaldone, but he went by Jay Smaldone. And she was like, wow, that sounds really familiar.
And their age was the same.
Their age. So her older sister and Uncle Jay's age were about the same. And so I was like, well, I'll send you a picture later of him and see if you recognize him. And so I sent her a picture of him on kind of when he was younger, high school era and a little bit older. And she was immediately like, that's him. That was him.
That is so funny.
Isn't that crazy?
You never know. Huh?
You never know. Yep. But yeah, so she has memories of Carboni's like you do and just all that good stuff.
That's cool.
It is. Yeah. It was really, really fun to talk to her. But, she, of course, originally contacted me because, we put out the Paisani Tells and, how we want to, if you have a story that you'd like to tell, we would love to tell it. And oh boy, did she have quite the story to tell. Yeah. In fact, as soon as I got off the phone with her, after, she kind of gave me the rundown of this story, I was so excited. I started researching right away. And it was funny because Jared and I were trying to pack and get ready for a, quick little weekend trip for the next day. And I'm like, I'll pack in the morning. I've got to keep researching. So when I spoke with Regina, I realized that this story was important to her because it truly impacted her grandfather. And her grandfather's name was Michael Frank Capra. Just talking with her, I could tell that her grandfather meant the world to her,
Yeah,
kind of
nice.
Yeah, exactly. Kind of reminded me of how we revere Papa, right. And how we love him, and a lot of the same demeanor, and we'll get into who he was and everything, but just a very, very sweet man.
That's good.
Yeah. And this story is important to her because of how it impacted his life. But before we get into Michael and the story of him, we really have to start by telling the story of his parents and his grandparents to truly understand Michael.
So that would be her great-grandparents.
Her great-grandparents, yes. And like I said, what a story this is. So buckle in, listeners. We've got an awesome Colorado Italian story to tell here. All right. So what we're actually going to do is we're going to start with telling the story of Michael's grandparents. And that is Costanzo Capra and Angela Marie Canzano. So Costanzo and Angela, I believe, were born in Molise, Italy. And I know that they were at least married there because the marriage certificate shows that they were married in Molise in 1876. But they arrived in America around 1900 with their 4 children, and they found their way to Leadville, Colorado. And so, Leadville is a very small town in Colorado, even now, but especially in the 1800s. Where most Italians came to Colorado, they went to Denver. Just kind of a brief history on Leadville. The gold and silver rush.
Lots of mining is going on.
Yeah, exactly, during this time. And so, they first came into Leadville, like the gold prospectors, around 1860 when gold was discovered in a gulch nearby. But Leadville, it was officially established in 1870 when Colorado had a silver boom. Leadville, was kind of considered a boom town because as soon as the silver came around, it boomed. But then we had a silver crash around 1890. And so Leadville kind of took a dive. But to try and rebound Leadville, even in the 1800s, they were like, hey, this is a cool, beautiful town in the middle of the mountains. Let's see if we can attract some tourists. And I found this little tidbit that I thought was kind of cool. They thought, we've got all this snow. Let's build an ice palace. That'll attract people to Leadville. And so they built this ice palace in 1896. And it was the largest ice structure that was ever built in North America at that time. But, they didn't really consider travel is a little difficult.
Yeah, Leadville's way high elevation in Colorado.
Oh, yeah. And so
it's hard to get to in the winter.
Even now, they close passes for the whole winter in Colorado because it's too dangerous. So with that being said, it didn't last long because people, didn't really want to travel to Leadville in the winter, especially at that time. And it was hard to get there. So they couldn't keep the ice palace going. But obviously they couldn't have it in the summer either because it would melt. I just thought that was kind of interesting.
Yeah, that's neat.
It is.
I wonder
neat.
if they do it now.
I don't know. I feel like I've heard about an ice palace somewhere in Colorado.
Me too, but I don't know where.
Where at, yeah. But of course, Leadville, it attracted a lot of Italians to the area because of the mining opportunities and the work opportunities. So Italians like Costanzo and Angela, they came to Leadville and that's where they kind of established themselves. And so a lot of small mining towns would develop around Leadville or kind of around the mines. And they were basically these small little towns that would pop up like shanty towns, kind of like little shacks and little like quickly built homes for the workers to live in. And one of these towns was called Tin Town. And this is where some of the Capra family lived. And I couldn't find a whole lot about Tin Town online. The town is referenced in old newspaper articles. It's even on the census at one point, but that's about all I could find. I did see in one article that the reporter referred to to Tin Town as the Italian village. So that's kind of cool. Yeah. It would be really neat to go see if any remnants of it are there.
Right.
It would be awesome.
Yeah. I've never heard of that.
I hadn't either until this story. So Costanzo and Angela, like I said, they found themselves living in the Leadville, Tin Town area. And Costanzo, he worked in the mines. And I'm sure, Angela, she was raising their 4 kids. So that was her job, of course. Like that's a lot of work. But, she probably did little things out of the home, maybe baking bread to sell for extra money, those kind of things. However, their lives, they were forever changed on April 30th, 1905, when Costanzo and his cousin Joseph Maestro, they were playing cards at the house, at Costanzo's house and having a few drinks. Maestro, he worked as a railroad hand for the Rio Grande Railroad in Leadville. And he would usually work nights, but this particular night, he didn't have to work. So he started out his day drinking in the local saloons and then decided to go to his cousin Costanzo's house,
And bring beer.
Yeah, so he did bring beer. And so he, had spent his whole day drinking and, it can sometimes not be a great situation. And so in one article I read, it said that Maestro, he was a constant visitor to Costanzo's house. He would, go over and visit whenever and just kind of walk in. He was always welcome, not knock on the door. And this particular night, that's exactly what he did. He just kind of came in and there was a bunch of people at the house and they all welcomed him, like, hey, come hang out with us. We're just, having dinner, playing cards. And Maestro, he later told the authorities that there were numerous family members there. There was Costanzo and his wife, Angela, their son, Frank, and his wife, Assunta, and their baby. And there was also Costanzo's sister, Maria, was there, and a neighbor, John. So, like we just talked about, Maestro, when he came over to play cards, he also brought beer for everybody. And he asked all the men at the house to pay him 10 cents for the beer. There's 2 other men there, and they paid him his 10 cents. And Costanzo was like, no, I'm not going to pay you your 10 cents. You brought the beer. I didn't ask you to. They were probably also feeding him. And
that's true.
And so he's like, I'm not paying you the 10 cents. And of course, this made tensions rise and led to an argument. And Maestro, he was so upset about this and left the house in a rage. And I think that they just kind of assumed that he was going home for the night because the remaining people in Costanzo's house said that they watched Maestro run to his own cabin. So they were like, he's just going home for the night. He's mad, but it is what it is. However, Maestro, he did return and he was holding his revolver. So he bust through the door and shot once at Costanzo, hitting him, and then fired 3 or 4 more times. Only 2 of the bullets actually struck Costanzo. One struck him in the chest and the other hit him in the arm right above the elbow. One of the other bullets, it was just a stray bullet, actually almost hit his sister and killed her. So this could have been, even worse than it is. So of course, this is complete chaos and terror is just going through the Capra house at this point. And an article in the Herald Democrat actually described Maestro as crazed with liquor until his brain was in a whirl.
That's sad.
Yeah, I know, it's not good. So like I said, Costanzo was struck by 2 bullets, and he apparently staggered to where his wife was and collapsed at her feet. And his wife, Angela, later said that when she looked in his eyes, she knew that he was going to pass away.
Oh,
I know. And it's like the fact that he just wanted to get to his wife is just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
It's like, phew. And so, like I said, it was chaos. The rest of the women in the house started screaming. And at this point, Maestro, he just took off. And if you remember earlier, I said that Costanzo's son, Frank, was there that night.
With his wife?
With his wife,
right.
Yeah. Frank, he just took off after Maestro. He just wanted to catch him. But Maestro had a pretty good head start and disappeared into the hills. So when Frank couldn't find him, he just, went back to the cabin to where his family was. Because this was his father who was shot. So there was also the neighbor, John. He was also at Costanzo's house. And he immediately left to just go tell the authorities what had happened. Once he told the authorities, he actually ended up getting on his own horse and ended up leading the authorities into the hills where Maestro had fled.
Oh,
I know.
Good.
Yeah, that's pretty cool. So after some searching, John and the authorities, they ended up finding Maestro, and Sheriff O'Mahony actually arrested Maestro. And when they searched him, they couldn't find the gun on him. So, they just suspected that when he was running off into the hills, he just chucked the gun to get rid of it. And when Maestro was arrested, he was, trying to tell the sheriff what happened. And he told the sheriff that the men at Costanzo's house were trying to kill him. And that was why he was running away. It's like, well, that's
a lot of witnesses there.
Yeah, that's not quite the truth there, buddy. And so this is kind of an interesting tidbit that I found in one of the newspaper articles. While the authorities and John are out searching for Maestro, the women who were still at the house, they held some type of a ceremony there. And I don't know if ceremony is exactly the right word, but it's so hard to sum up. I'm actually just going to read what the reporter wrote because it's really interesting. Okay, so this is from the Herald Democrat, and it goes, quote, "While the posse was scouring the hill for the murderer, the women held a weird wake. Standing in a circle in the small yard, they set up a sing-song that floated higher and higher in the air until it reached a shriek. At the same time, they swayed their heads from side to side with their bodies in perfect rhythm with the song. Gradually, it died down until only a faint murmur arose, and then it broke into a babble of harsh, discordant chatter," which is probably they're speaking in Italian, would be my guess.
That's true.
It would cease as suddenly as it began and then commence all over again. Well, the reporter's language is a little harsh and judgy here, I guess you could say. I kind of think it's beautiful what these women did.
Yeah, having their own wake in Italian. And
yeah.
It's her husband.
It's her husband.
Their dad.
Yeah, exactly.
Frank's dad.
Like where he says a babble of harsh, discordant chatter. I think they were probably out there maybe saying a prayer in Italian and, and I think it speaks to the Southern Italian women and that like their mourning rituals, which are very different, and they're loud and they wail and they cry. And so I'm sure to this reporter, he was probably like, I can't understand them. I don't know what they're doing. Like this is, and he even uses the word weird.
He tried to degrade it.
But I don't know. I can kind of picture it in the mountains and at night and these women out there. It's, I don't know, kind of beautiful if you think about it in a different way than this reporter.
Right.
So after Maestro was arrested and taken to the County City Jail, they brought in Frank, and they also wanted to interview him as well. And Frank told the sheriff that Maestro had only been in America a few months, and he had a wife who was still in Italy. And Frank said, quote, "Joe had it in for my father, and he was determined to get either him or me. He had been drinking a good deal, and I knew there was going to be trouble." Which I can agree with Frank. I mean, you can tell when somebody had been drinking and they're kind of on that edge a little bit. And I'm sure Frank was picking up on that.
Yeah, and he might have seen it with him before.
That's true. Because this is Costanzo's cousin and he's always at the house. He might have known how Joe could escalate.
Right.
So, and Frank also said that nobody was trying to kill Maestro, because remember, that's what Maestro was telling the sheriff, and nobody touched him. But it was reported in the paper that Maestro had cuts and bruises on his face. But I mean, the guy was running through the forest at night. Drunk.
He probably stumbled.
Exactly. It's like, I mean, you're going to probably not look too good after that. And your adrenaline's running, going crazy. And so, but a few days later, Maestro, he actually did end up confessing to killing Costanzo. And this all kind of came about because Frank decided he was going to go out in the woods and find the gun. And he actually did end up finding it. He just kind of headed out in the direction where Maestro took off, and he found the gun, which was a Smith & Wesson 38 caliber. And it was actually only located about 50 feet from the house.
Oh, wow.
And when Frank turned the revolver over to the sheriff immediately went in to show Maestro, "Hey, look, we found the gun. Let's talk about it." And with the gun as evidence, Maestro was like, "Yeah, I killed him."
Oh, that's good that he confessed.
He confessed. However, he kind of stuck to that whole self-defense claim. And, he kept saying that he was being attacked. And then in an interesting twist, he actually tells the sheriff that he didn't mean to shoot Costanzo, but instead meant to shoot Frank. Yeah.
Wow.
And so he said he was wanting to shoot Frank because Frank attacked him and this angered him. Frank, however, he denies this and said, no, I didn't attack Maestro. I needed to get him out of the house because he was escalating. And in fact, he tells the sheriff, quote, "I put him out of the house when I saw there was going to be trouble." So,
and that's when he went and got his gun.
So I think what happened was Maestro's mad. "I want my 10 cents. I want my 10 cents. And Frank's like, "This is going to get out of control. You got to go. Like, go home, sleep it off. We'll see you later." So yeah, I think that irritated him. And it's interesting because as like the interviews go on with the sheriff, you find more and more tidbits, like more truth comes out as they interview.
Yeah, that's what I'm seeing here. So that's good. Though.
Yeah, because it was initially first reported in the newspaper that Maestro was like, "I'm out of here. I'm
ran
leaving,"
out.
And ran out. But as he, as the sheriff is interviewing Maestro and Frank, kind of start putting the little
Frank
pieces.
Actually showed him his way out.
Yeah, showed him his way out. He's like, "You gotta go, man." And Maestro didn't like that. So Frank also tells the sheriff that he was upstairs when Maestro returned. So Frank probably gets Maestro out of the house, goes upstairs for whatever reason. And he says that he was looking out through the window and he could see Maestro coming back to the house and he could see the revolver in his hand. So Frank said, he yells to the others, "Maestro's coming back. Don't let him in, keep him out." And so he's trying to get downstairs as fast as he could, but unfortunately he was too late and Maestro entered the home before he got downstairs, and we know the rest. He shot and killed Costanzo. And a reporter with the Herald Democrat described Costanzo as being sort of the mayor of Tin Town. Keep in mind, Tin Town's not really an official town, just kind of like this, built up town. And I guess Costanzo, he was very respected in the village. And
right, that's what I was just gonna say. So
a lot of people in the village would actually, go to him for help, for loans. And in fact, some of the stores would actually contact Costanzo to see if certain people would be worthy of a line of credit.
Oh, so he was very well respected and trusted. And
exactly. And, I think probably a lot of Italians who maybe just came over from Italy, found themselves in Leadville. He was probably like that go-to person. Like,
right.
Hey, like this is kind of how this.
Show you the way around.
Exactly. Yeah. And so then, the store people would call him up and be like, "Hey, this new guy's in town. Can I trust him?" And so that's kind of a cool little tidbit about Costanzo. Mm-hmm. So a couple of days after Costanzo was killed, on May 2nd, 1905, the family had Costanzo's funeral. The funeral consisted of an 8-piece band that led the funeral procession through the town. And they actually, would end up, when it was all said and done, walking a few miles to the cemetery.
Wow. That shows you how well he was liked.
Exactly.
8-piece band.
8-piece band.
Lots of people.
Yeah, exactly. Because actually the funeral procession, it started at the Capra home. But behind the band was 8 carriages. 8 carriages that carried the friends and family of Costanzo's. However, even behind the 8 carriages, a lot of people just followed on foot the procession. And the procession, it stopped at the Church of Annunciation where the services were held. And the church, it was said to be completely packed.
Oh,
and
that's nice.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of people were like, oh my gosh, we lost this beacon of society, of our community. And so then, of course, after the church, the procession, it headed to St. Joseph's Cemetery with the band playing the entire time. And Tin Town was said to be in mourning the whole day of the funeral and the procession. People were dressed in all black. And even those who couldn't wear all black for one reason or another, maybe going to work or something.
Oh, okay.
They would tie like a black ribbon around their arm just to show the respect. I read in one article where people would even place a crepe over their doors to show that they were in mourning. I wasn't sure what this was. When I think crepe, I think
crepe paper.
I think a French pancake, like those little flat pancakes. So I looked it up though. And basically what it is people would just drape black fabric over their door as a sign to show we're in mourning over the loss of somebody. And according to the internet, a lot of different customs involved wearing heavy concealing black crepe veils. So I think when you look at like the funerals and like women have the veil that comes down.
Right.
I think that's what it is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. But getting back to Maestro, when his trial started, it was said that he was pretty emotionalist during the trial. And even when he took his stand in his own defense, he was pretty solemn and just kind of sat there. Now, keep in mind, he also didn't speak English very well. And so, he was probably sitting there kind of in a daze waiting for the interpreter to talk to him. Not that I'm defending Maestro here, but,
Right.
But regardless of his demeanor, on August 21st, 1905, Maestro was convicted of the murder of Costanzo Capra. And the verdict that they handed down was murder in the second degree. And his sentence was 10 years in Canyon City. Doesn't that seem a little light?
Why?
I don't know. It's funny because just researching a lot of these older cases, a lot of these sentences are really light, low in years. I guess it's just, I don't know. It's kind of weird.
Maybe they didn't have the life sentence back then.
That's true.
And they just picked an amount of years. I don't know.
Maybe they were like, we can't afford to feed you and house you for you're 20 years old. Like we can't keep you for that long. I don't know. It's just it seems a little light for a life.
Yeah.
10 years. So now we're going to get into the real juicy part of this story. This is the part when Regina relayed this part of the story to me. My jaw was on the floor. I was like, holy smokes. Yes, let's tell this story on the podcast. So we've mentioned Frank quite a bit so far. And now we're going to focus on him and his immediate family. So remember we talked about Frank and his family. He had a wife, Assunta, and together they had 3 children. Nick Costanzo Capra, who was born in 1904, Michael Frank Capra, who was born in 1906, and that's Regina's grandfather, and John Capra, who was born in 1910. So Frank, he was born February 9th, 1884 in Molise, Italy. And by 1900, he was living in Leadville, Colorado with his parents. And Frank was described in a local newspaper as having a pleasant and cheerful disposition, but had trouble resisting the temptations that came along with the local saloons, which we'll play into this story a little bit later. And Assunta, she was born on August 13th, 1884 in Molise, Italy. And she came to America around 1903-ish, somewhere, give or take a year. And her family, they actually settled in Wisconsin. But her and Frank, they somehow met and were married. I'm almost thinking maybe it was a set arranged marriage in Italy because, he came to America and went to Colorado. She came to America and went to Wisconsin.
Yeah. How did they meet?
So, and they were actually married in Cumberland, Wisconsin in January of 1904. I mean, if she came around to America in 1903, they're married in 1904, it had to have been set up when they were in Italy. Don't you think?
I guess. And they did that type of stuff, right?
They did, yeah. So it's complete speculation here. I'm just trying to put the pieces back together. You know, it's not like they had phones or internet or keep in touch and stuff. So, and so after the couple was married in Wisconsin, they, you know, moved back to Leadville and started their family. And Frank, he worked for the railroad, and the family, they lived in Tin Town. And actually, it's really interesting because Frank and Assunta ended up living in the home of Frank's parents. So,
where he was killed?
Where he was killed, yeah. So after Costanzo was shot and killed, Frank and Assunta moved into that home. So
that has to be a weird feeling.
Exactly. And especially because they were both there when Costanzo was killed. So, and I'm assuming maybe Frank's mother still lived there with them. I don't know.
Oh, that makes sense.
That makes sense. Yeah, kind of take care of her. Sadly, though, in October of 1910, they lost their son, John, and he was only 1 month old.
Oh,
I know. And the funeral, it was held at the Church of Annunciation, which is also where Costanzo's was. Okay, but getting back to Frank and Assunta, their marriage, it was a bit strained at this time. You know, Frank, he liked to drink and he liked to go gambling. So this left Assunta at home a lot with the kids. And it also left Assunta trying to come up with extra money to make ends meet, because if he's out drinking and gambling,
using up all the money.
Exactly. You know, Assunta, she was also pregnant at this time, and this is 1911. And you've got to think, like, they just lost their infant at a month old. Costanzo was killed just a few years prior to this. They're living in Leadville at this time. Like, you know, that alone is a struggle right there. So I can kind of see why the marriage is strained a little bit with all of those factors, the drinking, gambling, all that kind of stuff. Assunta, you know, she would bake bread to sell to make extra money. And, you know, I'm sure that this didn't bring in a lot of money for the family, but I can imagine it gave her a small sense of security.
Yeah, because he's spending all the money. So,
and so I'm sure, you know, she can sell the bread during the day and kind of keep that money and start saving it. Just probably made her feel a little bit more secure. However, though, unfortunately, at times Frank would demand that she give him the money that she was making from the bread so that he could go spend it on his extracurricular activities.
Wow.
This actually came up on the night of May 21st, 1911. Frank came to Assunta and said, "I want the money that you made from selling bread today." So Assunta, she wasn't having it at this point, and she told him no. And he actually told her he wanted the money for, quote, so that he could go to a dance.
Oh, wow.
I know. Assunta, though, she had a feeling that he was just going to go buy liquor and hang out in the saloons, so she refused. But in one paper, I did see that he wanted the money for a new shirt so that he could look snazzy for the dance. Regardless, though, Assunta still refused to give him the money. And she told him, "Well, if you're going to go to the dance, I'm going to go with you." And he told her no.
Wow.
And, you know, this is, of course, two different papers kind of reporting different stories. So I'm sure it was a combination. There's the truth in the middle somewhere.
Right.
And I don't blame her. I would have had a problem with him going to a dance too.
Right. Because you know what happens there.
Exactly. You don't go to a dance without your wife.
Right.
Regardless, though, this infuriated Frank that she wouldn't give him the money, and he threatened to send her back to Italy. But he still left the house, and he didn't return for quite a few hours. When he did come home, he was, of course, intoxicated and passed out. Now, one paper that I read, it reported that when Frank got home, he beat Assunta and then passed out. You know, regardless, this is a tough situation for the family to be in.
Right. The man isn't
holding up his end of the bargain there. Yeah. And so the next morning, Assunta got up, she made breakfast for the family, and then she walked out into the front yard and grabbed an axe from the woodshed. She then walked back into their house, entered the bedroom where Frank was sleeping, and struck him in the head 3 times with the blunt end of the axe.
Oh my goodness.
Did you see that one coming? After that, she went out and she washed the axe off. She grabbed her 2 sons, Mike and Nick, and walked to her neighbor, Bessie Boney's house, and told her, "I have killed my husband. He wanted to drive me back to Italy and I would not go." So that happened. That's a little crazy.
That's very crazy, but Good grief, if he was beating her all the time and spending all the money. And
I'm
not saying that was proper, but
sure. No, I completely, we're not condoning murder here, but
right.
I feel like she was at that point where she was like, what am I going to do?
Right.
I mean, she's pregnant. It's just...
And if he's threatening her constantly.
Exactly. And we'll find out later that he wasn't just threatening her, that he'd send her back to Italy. He was physically threatening her as well. And I'm sure he beat her.
Oh, I'm sure.
So the Boulder Daily Camera, they reported on this, and they had a really crazy headline. It said, Miss Frank Capra, gentle spouse of Leadville, puts her husband to sleep with an axe. They were very straightforward back then. So. And the Herald Democrat, the Leadville newspaper that we've talked about, their headline said, brained him in his sleep. Assunta Capra, wow. I know. Assunta Capra buries an axe in the head of husband who had abused her.
Wow.
So, she goes to the neighbor's house. The authorities are contacted, and the undersheriff, William Angus, he came to the house and found that Frank was actually still alive. He was still breathing, but told the papers it was bad. His skull was pretty much crushed in. And Frank, he did end up dying on the way to the hospital. He was 28 years old at this time.
Wow.
And Assunta, she was 27. You got to think about this. This is the same house that 6 years prior, Frank's father died in.
Good grief.
Kind of a crazy twist, huh? Mm-hmm. Assunta, she later told the authorities, quote, I killed him because he abused me. In fact, the Herald Democrat, it reported the abuse by saying, quote, the tragedy was the result of long-standing domestic troubles that had entered the little Italian home soon after the merry sound of wedding bells had seized. Capra, who's employed as a helper in the Denver and Rio Grande shops, it is said, spent all of his money that he received for drinking and gambling. He was not true to his wife and family, and the story of the abuse which the little woman and her children, 2 little boys, 4 and 6 years of age, suffered at his hands, and a long and pitiful one.
Well, that one told the truth.
That told the truth.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, this reporter really summed it up right there.
Right.
I mean, she had to do what she had to do to protect her family at this point. I can't even imagine.
Right, because she was probably thinking that she would be next.
And she's pregnant, and a 4 and a 6-year-old. So
it's sad, but like you said, that article really summed it up. I feel that was the truth.
I do too. It really kind of gives you an insight into the terror that would happen in this house and how she felt. I mean, just reading that gives me this gut sick feeling oh gosh, that's harsh. So the autopsy report, it was released, and it stated that Frank, he was actually sleeping on his right side when Assunta struck him, and his injuries consisted of a wound over the left side of the ear, one on the top of the head, and a third wound around the left temple. But there was one odd thing that the coroner pointed out. He said that there was a small hole directly behind and to the left of his temple, and the coroner said it went in his head about 3.5 inches.
Ooh.
I know.
Gave me goosebumps.
Yeah, mom's got a little goosebumps. And the coroner said he was, quote, baffled over this. So I don't know what this was. Just because, she hit him with the blunt end of the butt end of the axe.
Unless he hit his head on something.
That's true. The undersheriff, when he was, contacted about the murder, he actually had, this is so interesting to me. He actually had the saloon keeper, Mr. Barnoli, take Assunta and the 2 boys to the jail.
Wow.
I know. But, Leadville's small. It was probably the sheriff and the undersheriff and...
Go get the saloon keeper.
And so, Assunta and the 2 boys, they were taken to the jail. And then a family friend, Anton Rossi, came and got the 2 boys. And during the initial interviews, the authorities asked Assunta if she committed the crime. And she said, quote, yes, I killed him. He abused me. And that was it. That was what she said.
Well, again, she's speaking the truth.
She is, yep. And Frank, he was laid to rest on May 26, 1911, and his funeral was also at the Church of Annunciation. However, unlike his father's elaborate and fully attended funeral, Frank's funeral was pretty bleak. Not a lot of people showed up. The Herald Democrat actually reported that not one woman or one girl attended the funeral, and only a few men showed up to the funeral.
Well, that explains exactly what type of a man he was. If you can call him that.
Exactly, 100%. It speaks volumes to who he was.
Right.
Because those women weren't at the church mourning for Frank. They were actually out protesting for Assunta's release from prison or from jail.
That's amazing at this time.
It really is.
Because that has to be hard for a woman back then to speak up, especially on something like this against a man.
Because she has to be worrying about, like, what's my husband going to be thinking?
Right. Back then, the men would be saying, no, you're not going out there protesting about anything.
You know, and even the priest at the funeral, he preached the necessity of living a good and moral life.
Good.
This is like one of my favorite parts of this story. The Italian women of Leadville and Tin Town area came out to support Assunta. Maybe even non-Italian women came out. Who knows? But women came out and they were not only supporting her, but like I said, they were demanding that she be cleared of all charges and set free because they knew her husband was cruel.
That's what I was just going to say. That tells you that, you know, it wasn't one time or anything.
It was over and over.
Yeah, everybody knew about it.
Everybody knew about it. And for only, you got to think about it like, okay, no women or girls attended the funeral. Only a few men attended the funeral. So even the majority of the men were like, well, it is what it is. I'm not going to the funeral, you know.
Good for them.
Yeah. You got to think, a lot of the women, they were probably really close. Especially the Italian women, they didn't speak English very well. They probably baked bread together, washed clothes together, helped each other out with the clothes or with the kids. So they knew. They all talked, you know, but regardless, unfortunately, of the protests, the proceedings continued. They held a coroner's jury and a lot of witnesses took the stand. And so the main witness was Carl Farella, and he was actually living with Frank and Assunta at this time. And he kind of outlined the argument that took place between Frank and Assunta on that Sunday. And so he said that Assunta told Frank she wasn't going to bake any more bread to sell because he just takes the money and spends it on liquor. And Carl said that Frank responded to this by saying he would go get his rifle and give her, quote, a lick. So I'm assuming hit her with it. And Carl said that Assunta, she started crying and said, why would you do this to me? I'm your wife. Even this guy who's living with him is like, it's not a good situation. Carl said that the next morning he noticed Frank was asleep and, you know, Assunta was doing her household duties, all of that kind of stuff. So he left to visit a friend. And a little while later, he heard the rumors that Frank was dead. So Carl, he runs back to the house and he actually ended up staying with Frank until he was taken to the hospital.
Oh, wow.
And Bessie, the neighbor that Assunta went to, she was also a witness at this jury hearing. And she said that Assunta came to her house that morning and told her to call the police because she killed her husband. And Bessie told her that she didn't believe her. And Assunta said, if you don't believe it, you can go and see. Bessie obviously believed her because the authorities were called. And so based off of all of these hearings and the witness testimony, Assunta, she was charged with murder and her trial was set for July 5th. And they put her bond at $3,000, which is about $100,000 today. Yeah. That's just thinking of Assunta and in her situation. She was probably like, yeah, that's not happening. I mean, that's unfathomable.
Yeah, that kind of blows me away because then you go back to the guy that killed
Costanzo.
Yeah, and he got 10 years.
10 years.
For killing, and they set the bond at this high.
At this high
for
her.
this lady.
Exactly. But he gets
almost
out.
Self-defense.
Pretty much self-defense, and she can't get out. Like, that's unfathomable, that amount of money. It's unfathomable for most people today.
Right.
But while Assunta was in jail awaiting trial, her sister-in-law was actually taking care of the two boys. And this is so sweet. She would bring them to the jail every day to see their mother.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, because, you know, those kids were probably like, what is happening?
Right.
You know, and Assunta probably just wanted to see her kids. And the little boys, they would bring Assunta candy or some type of a sweet for her every day.
Oh, that's good.
I know. I thought that was a sweet story. Like we talked about earlier, the Italian women and perhaps non-Italian women, they would go and protest on behalf of Assunta. They would also have petitions signed and sent to the district attorney saying, this is self-defense. Let her go. She's pregnant. Her husband was cruel. Let her go.
That's just amazing. Back 1911.
I know. It really blows my mind.
They're just good for them.
Oh, I know. I have so much respect. Respect and honor for what these women were like, we're standing up for her. And, you know, the sad reality is maybe a lot of them were also in that same situation. And we're like, this could happen to us too.
Could be, because what's a husband if he's abusive, what's he going to say to her?
Exactly. And so, you know, they wanted her released and all the charges dropped. And like I said, they were telling the DA, like, hey, this is self-defense. She's also pregnant. You've got to really look at this case. And it worked because a month later, when Asunta's trial was to start, the day of the trial, July 5th, the DA, he approached the stand, the judge, and said, I am dismissing all of the charges.
Wow.
Isn't that amazing?
That's cool.
Yeah. So Asunta, she didn't know what was going on. She did not speak English. She didn't understand English very well. You know, she was just kind of sitting there while all of this was happening. And the judge was like, all right, okay, we'll let her go. I agree. And so Asunta was kind of looking around, and the interpreter looked over at her, at the district attorney, and was like, tell her she's free. She can go home. And the interpreter was like, you're free. You can go home. And she just left.
That's so cool. It gives me a tear of joy.
Me too. I know. Tears of happiness in this kind of sad, tragic story.
Especially that year.
I know, 1911. Yeah. So the district attorney, his last name was Hogan. And he said that he just dismissed it because of the insistent demands and petitions of the women in the Leadville area. And honestly, to Hogan's defense, he also told the newspapers that once he kind of started diving into it and learning all of the circumstances, he actually ended up developing a great deal of sympathy for Asunta.
I'm sure.
Which again tells you the truth about Frank. So Hogan was actually quoted saying, technically she's guilty of the crime, but I felt that it was right to dismiss all the charges.
Wow.
Makes me laugh for him to be like, yeah, she's guilty, but
we're going to let this one slide.
We're going to let this go.
Thank goodness.
I know. Numerous newspapers across the country picked this up and reported, you know, the whole situation, how Frank was abusive and Asunta was set free due to the protests and the petitions of these women. And so it was kind of cool. I mean, everything from like Miami, Wisconsin, like all over the country, this was reported.
That's really nice because that speaks a lot.
It does.
Because I bet a lot of men, abusive men, thought twice after this happening.
I hope so. Because yeah, she got off on self-defense. And it's actually really interesting because that you brought that up, because I saw that this situation was actually compared in the newspapers a lot to a really similar situation that happened in Canada. So this lady, her name was, and she's Italian, well, obviously you'll know by the name, Angelina Napolitano. So she was living in Canada, and she also murdered her husband because he was abusive towards her. Angelina was also pregnant at the same time, but she was not released. Canadian authorities, justice system, was waiting for her to give birth, and then she was to be hanged in the gallows.
Goes from one extreme to the next.
Yeah. And like I said, they compared Asunta and Angelina in newspapers across the country, compared these two. And they were very, very similar. In one newspaper headline I saw, it said something like, United States is more gallant than Canada. Because they were comparing those. So, but back to Asunta. Like I said, she was free. She went back home, and she was living in the same home where her father-in-law was killed and her husband lost his life. So, but what was she to do? Where was she to go? I mean, It was her home. And neighbors, they actually told the local newspaper that Asunta would often weep over the death of her husband, and she regretted her part in his death. And I'm sure she did. I mean, you don't want to have to take it to those extremes, but he took it to an extreme a lot. A reporter from the Herald Democrat, he actually visited Asunta at her home, and this is what they had to say. A visit to Miss Capra proves that she is not a normal human being. No one but an abnormal person could slew the blood-stained floor and walls where she committed her crime and daily chop wood with the very axe she used to brain her husband, and still say that she is very sorry. Here is a case for psychologists and criminologists to get busy on.
Wow.
And where was Asunta supposed to go? It's 1911. Her husband, who, quote, made money, I'm putting that in quotes because he spent it, is gone. Women didn't have a lot of options at this time. You know, it's a small town. What was she, like, where's this reporter? What does he expect her to do?
Right. And what state of mind did she actually get to? He's got to understand what she's went through. Yes.
To where it wasn't like she just woke up one morning and was like, yeah, you're a pretty good husband, but I'm going to kill you. Frank pushed her to that limit. And that reporter is not taking that into account there. Kind of on this same point, the paper also reported, how she was in financial distress. And of course, I mean, she was baking bread to make probably very little money. That's not enough for her to make ends meet at this point. This paper reported that she was hoping to get her husband's insurance payout. Now, I couldn't find if this was a life insurance policy or maybe like I don't know. I don't know what kind of a insurance policy this was, but I can't see any insurance company being like, oh, you murdered him? Sure, here's the money. Yeah. You know what I mean? So I don't know what kind of a policy this was, but she was really wanting it. And of course she was, because the policy, it was for $2,000, which is about $65,000 today. Good grief. I mean, that's life-changing for her at that point. I'm not really sure if she ever got the insurance. I saw in where it kind of went through the court system a little bit. She was still selling bread, but one of the local newspapers, it reported that the Italian people, however, do not let her want for food. Of course, they're not going to let her. She will have food. She's Italian and she lives around Italians. She will have food. Right. But, Assunta, she found a way to kind of keep moving forward. She was living in the home. And in December of 1911, she gave birth to a baby boy because remember, she was pregnant during that time. I'm not sure what she named the baby, but I can only imagine the mixed emotions she must have had at this moment, Sadly, though, this baby boy, he did pass away 4 months later in March. Grief. And I'm not sure from what. I also have to think back to the night that Frank was murdered, or to the night before Frank was murdered. If he came home and beat her,
that's true.
What kind of a toll does that take on a baby, Mm-hmm. So the baby, it was buried in the local cemetery. And because of Assunta's, financial situation, the county actually ended up paying for the burial. One day I was researching this and called Mom and I was like, how far away is Leadville? And she's like, it's like a 3.5 hour drive. And I'm like, so too long for a day drive? Because I was like, I want to go to the cemetery and find this gravestone. You want to go on
a day trip?
I know. She's like, yeah. I was like, you want to go on a day trip? And she's like, I don't know. And then I got to thinking about it and I'm like, maybe that's a trip for the summer.
Because I actually looked the weather up, and that Saturday that we were planning
was not a good Saturday.
No.
It would have been
that pass. I think it's Tennessee Pass. And it had a lot of snow.
Oh gosh, yeah, that would have been bad. And Mom's like, maybe we do that in the summer. So yeah, Mom and I might take a trip this summer and head to Leadville and go check that out.
Yeah.
At some point, after the murder of Frank, the loss of the baby, Assunta, and keep in mind her financial situation, she actually ended up sending Michael and Nick to St. Vincent's orphanage in Denver. I would bet that she sent them there probably after the baby died. I think mentally everything kind of caught up with her and she just needed to get herself and her situation back to some sort of a balance for her. But she did eventually get the boys back. So, they weren't there forever. I think she just needed a mental break probably. But while in the orphanage, Michael, who is, again, Regina's grandfather, he had an unfortunate accident where he was struck in the head with a baseball bat. And unfortunately, this actually caused him to develop epilepsy. He didn't have it before, but this head injury caused that to happen. Sad. I know. And it would actually factor in his future life, which we'll talk about later. And just to think about, this is Regina's grandfather who, just talking with her, I can tell she loved so much. Just thinking about like everything that he'd gone through in this short amount of time in his life is just so sad. And like I said, we'll get into his future, but he was truly a strong man. And even as a young boy, he was just a strong, resilient guy. And he was crafty too, because in 1919, so, Assunta had got him and Nick back by this time, and they were back living in Leadville. In 1919, he was 13 years old, and he started his own business, sort of. We'll talk about that. But like I said, he was crafty. He found ways to keep moving forward. And so Michael, he had a cart and a burro, a donkey. And he would go around the city of Leadville collecting ash piles to take to the city dump, so everybody had their wood burning stoves and that kind of stuff to keep warm. And they would put the piles, I'm assuming, out on the street to be picked up. And so Michael, he would go around and for a small fee, he would gather people's ashes and take them to the city dump. And this isn't a bad gig for a 13-year-old. Right. That'd be kind of fun. You've got your little donkey and you're cart. And the only problem with this is the city already had a contracted man to do this job. So yeah.
Michael.
Michael. And so this position, it was called the city scavenger, which I thought was kind of an interesting name. And so the city, they came to Michael and they warned him like, hey, stop collecting ashes. Like, you're taking away this man's job. Like, we're already paying for him. But Michael and his little burro would continue gathering ashes for the next few weeks. And in my opinion, I'm like, hey, healthy competition.
Right.
Like, we don't have monopolies. Like, he's just creating healthy competition. And so, like I said, he would continue gathering the ashes. But one day he met a police officer on his rounds. And they ended up actually throwing poor little Michael into the city jail.
What?
I know. And he's 13.
Yeah.
He was only there for 2 hours. So, but it was really kind of cute because the local newspaper reported that his burro would send out, quote, lonesome calls for Michael.
He's braying for him.
He's braying for him. Like, let him out.
That's really cute.
I know. That's so cute. The sheriff heard that they had locked Michael up and he headed down to the jail to set him free. But I'm sure he talked to Michael first, like, hey, you got to quit, man.
Right.
And it sounds like Michael did after this.
Probably scared him.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah. Like, that's terrifying. Now, Michael's brother, Nick, he also had his own ventures in Leadville. At the age of 14, he was actually working as a bellboy at the Vendome Hotel in Leadville. But Nick, he was kind of a born performer. And one day, Nick and some of his friends, they were putting on a play for each other in the railroad yards. And this play, it was Western themed. And Nick was actually playing the part of a lawn mustache desperado. And I guess I saw in the article where he had like a really elaborate costume for this, like for his plays and his performances. And that's why he worked at the Vendome Hotel. He would save all of his money and, order like the chaps and the like, fur hat, like the desperado hats and stuff. But Nick also had a .22 caliber gun that he was using for this play. And so
a real gun?
A real gun. Yeah. And so they were firing the gun at each other's feet, like they do in the movies, like dance, 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 pew, pew, pew. And so, well, Nick, he shot the gun, and this is Leadville. The ground is frozen solid. And the bullet ricocheted off the ice and actually hit one of the other youngsters in the leg.
Oh, good grief.
I know. The kid was okay. Like, I think it was a graze because they said that they just kind of addressed the wound and sent him home. And Nick, he didn't get in any trouble. So
and maybe take the gun.
Yeah. But Nick didn't get in any trouble, which is kind of funny to think about. Like, Michael is just gathering ashes on the street and they throw him in jail. But what do you do? But getting back to Assunta, in 1915, Assunta, she remarried. She married a man named Antonio Ambatesso, but he also went by Tony Gam. And they actually had a son together in 1915 that they named Louis. Sadly, though, Louis would pass away in 1929 at the age of 14. So this is the third child that Assunta has lost.
Good grief.
I know. But going back to their marriage, Antonio, he was no gem. He was also abusive and cruel to her as well.
Oh boy.
I know. And so this is crazy. The couple, they were married on February 16th, but on February 25th, the Herald Democrat reported that Assunta was in the courthouse asking for a divorce. So we're talking 9 days? Later, she was like, whoa, wow. I don't want to do this anymore. And so, like I said, it was reported that she went to the county courthouse and she was in tears. And she was saying that, he had threatened to kill her and she just wanted a divorce. But the courts told her, like, we can't help you. You got to go get a lawyer. And she would go and she would report the abuse to the police. And so hopefully she was able to separate from him because they did end up getting a divorce, but that it wasn't until July of 1916. So hopefully she didn't have to live with him that whole time, basically.
Right.
Interestingly, Antonio, he ended up passing away in 1918. And the paper said that he passed away from pneumonia. But I actually wonder if he had the Spanish flu because this was the beginning of the Spanish flu epidemic because nobody was actually allowed to go to the funeral due to a ruling from the Board of Health. So,
that makes sense.
Yeah, I would bet that, think like we're just a little bit out of COVID, and we even had that situation where
pandemic. So
even people weren't allowed to really have funerals in 2020. So I would bet that he had Spanish flu. But somewhere around 1920, Asunta and the two boys, they ended up leaving Leadville and they moved to Denver. So if our story from now on will be in Denver, Colorado. And in May of 1920, Asunta, she married a Nunzio Capra in Denver, Colorado. Kind of seems like maybe she found some happiness with Nunzio because they were married until Asunta passed away in 1932 at the age of 48.
Well, that's good.
Yeah.
Wow, she was young too.
Actually, it's funny that you said that because when I was doing the math to see how old Asunta was when she passed away, it kind of shocked me that she was only 48 years old. I kept thinking, I don't know, I just thought that she would be a lot older. I actually got my calculator out and I'm like, am I right about this? I checked it a couple of times because I was thinking of her as being 60s, 70s because she had lived, so much had happened in her life. And it was just such full of tragedy and heartbreak.
That's true.
Which might have contributed to the passing away at 48, It's a lot of stress.
Well, at least she found somebody that she loved, hopefully, and loved her back.
I'm hoping that she found some sort of peace towards the end of her life. Honestly, I didn't really find a whole lot in the newspaper about Asunta after she moved to Denver and married Nunzio. So no news is good news. Yeah. So let's start talking about Regina's nono, Michael Frank Capra. And so when I talked to Regina about telling the story on the podcast, it was clear the love and admiration that she has for her nono. And she mentioned a few times how she really admired his resilience. And after hearing about Michael and researching him, she wasn't kidding. Even at the age of 13, after having the injury from the orphanage, he was still trying to make money, you know? So it's definitely clear how amazing he was. So like we mentioned earlier, Michael was born in Leadville in 1906. And his early years were hard. We know all about that. His father was killed. He had to be placed in an orphanage, and he even spent a couple hours in jail. But I think like Asunta, life really started to improve a bit when they moved to Denver. I found a couple of articles where Michael and his brother Nick may have played baseball in Denver. And I'm not 100% sure if this is them, but the article said Mike Capra and his brother N Capra. So probably a high likability that it was them. And while in Denver, Michael met Florence Sandina Canino. And in March of 1924, the couple was married at Mount Carmel Church in Denver. And Canino is a big name in Denver.
Right.
Yeah. And so
Canino sausage.
Canino sausage. Yeah. I don't know if this is that Canino family, but yeah, there's a Canino sausage in Denver. And so, like I said, the couple, they were married at Mount Carmel Church. And this is actually the same church that Florence's parents were married in. And Mount Carmel Church in Denver, it's heart of Little Italy, It's such a beautiful church. And Florence's parents, they came to America from Calabria. Florence, she actually went by Flora. She was born in Denver in 1906. And Regina, she related some really sweet stories about Flora, and she called Flora Nana. She said that her Nana was an amazing baker and everyone loved her cookies, especially her Pizzelle and Anginetti cookies. And Regina said she still loves to make them to this day.
Oh, that's cool.
Isn't that cool? Yeah. Flora, she was a volunteer for the Veterans of Foreign Wars organization for many decades. And Regina said that she served at the local VFW on Pecos Street. Oh, so this is a really funny story. So Regina's mom was pregnant with her at that time. I guess her and Flora, they were scrubbing the kitchen floors at her house, and Regina's mom went into labor.
Oh, wow.
I know. And Flora told her, well, we have to finish the floors first. And Regina even wrote, "This is such an Italian mother." That one, I just thought that just made me giggle. That was so adorable.
That is funny.
And Regina said that, whenever she'd have a headache or she didn't feel well, that her Nana would say a prayer in Calabrese over her, and that she would always dance with the kids, and she sang Italian songs, and that she was really dedicated to her faith and church. So Flora and Michael, her grandparents, they lived close to the church, which is Mount Carmel. And when the bells would ring during the day, they would kneel and made the sign of the cross. And that just kind of showed like her love for God. And it just really created a good foundation for Regina and her
No,
family.
that's cool. That's a nice story.
Yeah. And she ended up closing the email that she sent me, just talking about how, Flora was the backbone of the family and that she was always taking care of her parents and siblings, even up to their passing.
Oh, that's sweet.
And she just seemed like such an amazing lady. Like I said, the story about making sure the floors are clean, it's just
that's
so
great.
I would have loved to see Regina's mom's face when, she turned to her and was like, okay, but we have to clean the floors first. She was probably like,
because when you go into labor, your water breaks.
that's true.
Now Flora, we got more work to do.
Yeah, Flora was probably like, we just cleaned that area. Now we got to clean it again. In 1925, Flora and Michael, they had their first child, Suzanne Marie Capra, and that was Regina's mother. And 5 years later, in 1930, they had their son, Frank Louis Capra, which is probably a tribute to Michael's father, Frank, and his half-brother, Louis. Because, Michael's father, Frank, had passed away, so he named his son Frank.
Oh,
and then,
okay.
Yeah, his half-brother, Louis, had passed away, so they gave him that middle name.
Right.
Like we talked about earlier, Michael had that injury at the orphanage and it caused him to have epilepsy. And due to this, it was hard for him to gain and or retain employment because, epilepsy at that time, that's hard to treat. And so he would have seizures and, you couldn't have that on the job. And so, of course, that impacted his employment opportunities. And he also couldn't get a driver's license as well.
Oh.
So, but, he was a resilient guy and this did not stop him from working. He was an amazing carpenter. And Regina told me that he would make little beds for her dolls. He would also make furniture and jewelry boxes that he would sell to the Italian community of Denver.
Oh, that's nice.
I know.
Yeah.
It'd be so cool to get your hands on one of those jewelry boxes. And so Michael, he would start his day off by kissing Flora goodbye and then heading out to his workshop to work on his projects.
Yeah, his job.
Yeah. And Regina sent me a photo and I'm pretty sure it's of Michael, because he looks like he's out working in like a workshop. So we'll post that on the Instagram page. And in July of 1950, their daughter Suzanne married John Krantz and they had two daughters, Janine, which was Uncle Jay's girlfriend.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And Regina, and they also had a son. And in 1974, and I love this story, this is so sweet, Michael and Flora, they celebrated their 50th wedding anniversary at Mount Carmel Church, which is where they were married.
Right.
And Regina was a bridesmaid in the ceremony.
Oh, wow.
How cute is that? That's amazing.
Yeah.
And I just, like I said, this is one of the cutest things I've ever heard.
Right.
How amazing to have your granddaughter be a bridesmaid at your 50th anniversary. And what a great memory for Regina.
Right, that's special.
I'm sure those are amazing pictures. With the family, they really seemed to thrive. And from what Regina told me, they were happy and just a really close-knit family. And, she talked about how growing up and spending time with her family are just like some of the greatest moments of her life. And she just loves reminiscing about that.
That's great.
Yeah. In 1990, Nick, Michael's brother, he passed away at the age of 86 in Denver. And if you remember, we talked about how Nick was a performer in his younger years.
Oh, yeah.
And well, that actually continued throughout adulthood for Nick. And he had a local band and they would play in the Denver area. So
that's good.
Yeah. Regina actually, she sent me some of the advertisements and they were pretty cool. So
good.
Yeah. And in 1995, Michael, he passed away in Denver at the age of 89. So Nick and Michael lived a nice long life, which is good. And his funeral was at Mount Carmel and he was buried at Mount Olivet. And Flora, she passed away in 1999 at the age of 92. And her funeral was also held at Mount Carmel and she was buried next to Michael at Mount Olivet.
Oh, that's sweet.
Yeah. So now we want to close this episode about this amazing, resilient man by reading a letter that Regina wrote in memory of her grandfather, Michael. And this is such a sweet and beautiful letter. And I'll try to get through this without tears or my voice cracking because it's such a sweet letter.
Wow.
So she starts the letter, in memory of my grandfather, Michael Capra. As a child, I was unaware of the tragic events that plagued my grandfather's early life. My memories are that of a sweet, quiet, smiling, loving, and gentle man. My grandfather was an exceptionally gifted carpenter, and the work brought him great joy. I vividly recall his incredible talent and honorable work ethic. He executed his daily routine like clockwork, rising early each day and dressing for work. He ate breakfast, kissed my grandmother, and headed out the back door and crossed the tiny manicured yard and headed into his workshop wonderland, a detached garage that he had converted into an elaborate carpentry shop filled with tools, drills, and an array of power saws. There in his workshop, he created beautiful furniture for his family, large elaborate jewelry boxes with drawers lined in velvet, which were sold to the Italian enclave neighbors and gifted to his family. One of my fondest memories is when he created a small version of a child's crib, complete with wheels, mattress, blankets, and sweet bunnies painted on the head and foot, crafted special for me and my beloved dolls. He completed a full day's work that included a coffee and lunch break. At the end of each day, he returned to the house and spent his evenings with my grandmother while enjoying his pipe and black cherry tobacco. Countless hours were spent in my grandparents' home, and as I grew up, the stories began to emerge. Tells of his turbulent childhood while living in Leadville in a home governed by an abusive father and fearful mother. My heart is heavy and saddened that he was present in the home the day of his father's death. He walked hand in hand with his mother, who was pregnant at the time, and oldest brother as she reported the crime to local authorities. I must be candid and say that considering the horrors he suffered at his father's hand, I have only empathy for my great-grandmother, who was compelled to take her husband's life in order to protect her unborn child, 2 young boys, and herself. Nana, my grandmother, told me he was sent to live in an orphanage for a time, around the time of the murder. And in the orphanage, my grandfather developed epilepsy after he was struck in the head with a baseball bat. Epilepsy was difficult to treat back then, and it left him facing more challenges. He had difficulty keeping a job due to frequent seizures and could not get a driver's license. He walked to church on Sundays at Our Lady of Mount Carmel and to the Italian markets in Denver's Little Italy. Writing was difficult because he was left-handed, which was not allowed in his parochial school. His left hand was struck with rulers by the nuns, and he never quite mastered writing with his right hand. He experienced life during the Depression and World War II, which came with huge financial challenges. Yet somehow, through all the horrors and tragedies, he persevered. And he loved God, his family, and life. He found a way to provide for his 2 children and wife and created a safe, warm, and loving home. He was a very quiet man, but always smiling and happy. He was adored by children and grandchildren, and he remained very close to his older brother throughout his life. If I could sum up my grandfather in one sentence, I would say he was a living example of the fruits of the Spirit, showing love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, gentleness, and self-control. Ti amo, Nonna. Petunia.
Wow.
I know, that's so sweet. And Michael called Regina Petunia.
Oh, okay.
So...
yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah. Oh, what an amazing letter.
That's excellent. I have a tear running down my cheek.
Me too. I am teared up. I had to stop a couple of times and be like,
right.
Okay, deep breath. Don't crack during the letter. But what a way to end this episode. I mean,
that's excellent. That's sweet.
Sums up.
So heartwarming.
So heartwarming. Yeah. And it just truly sums up the strength and resilience and love that Michael had, regardless of what he went through. And he passed that on to his family, and what a family it was.
Yeah. Wonderful story.
Wonderful story. And we just want to say, Regina, thank you so much for sharing this story and for letting us tell the amazing story of the Capra family on our podcast. We are truly, truly honored.
Yes, we are, Regina. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, we hope you enjoyed listening to the amazing and uplifting story of Michael Frank Capra, and we hope you come back to listen to more stories about Italian Americans. See you next time.
See you next time.